Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Maya Crawford Peacock, and I am the Executive Director of OWLS, and the Executive Director of the Campaign for Equal Justice and past President of OWLS and current member of the Oregon Women Lawyers Working Parents Committee, and am really happy to be here today along with some very knowledgeable folks from the Student Borrower Protection Center who will present to us today about everything we need to know about public service loan forgiveness and the new temporary rules that are in place until the end of this year. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our speaker today along with her colleagues who are on hand for question and answer. Please use the chat function of today's Zoom to put your questions in, and we will be monitoring those. The presentation itself is about 40 minutes, give or take, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So with that, I'd love to introduce our speakers, some amazing folks that I heard present at the end of last year, along with our Congresswoman, Suzanne Bonamici. So these folks are really experts, and I'm just so pleased that we have them here today. Our presenter is Amy Zulata. She is the Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Previously, Amy was a research analyst at 32BJ SEIU in New York City. And prior to her work with SEIU, Amy was heavily involved in research and activism around wage theft in the greater Denver, Colorado area. And she was also part of the sanctuary movement in Denver. Amy graduated with her master's degree in international studies from the Joseph Corvell School at the University of Denver and has her bachelor's degree in English and Spanish from LaSalle University in Philadelphia. So thank you, Amy, for being here. I also want to introduce Amy's colleagues, who again will sort of be in the background and will be on hand for a question and answer session. We have with us today Kat Welbeck, who's the Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Council at the Student Borrower Protection Center, where her work primarily focuses on examining the student debt crisis through the lens of racial and economic justice. Prior to joining the SBPC, Kat worked in the CFPB's External Affairs Division, and before beginning her legal career, Kat taught 4th grade in Houston, Texas. She currently serves as a board member and program director of Rising Leaders, Inc., a mentoring and leadership development program for middle school students. She received her BA in sociology and certificate in African American studies from Princeton University and her JD from the University of Pennsylvania. We also have Winston Berkman-Breen, Deputy Director of Advocacy and Policy Council at the Student Borrower Protection Center. This is where he leads the organization's state and legislative regulatory work. Prior to joining the Student Borrower Protection Center, Winston was the Director of Consumer Advocacy and Student Loan Advocate at the Department of Financial Services, which is New York State's financial regulator. Winston is a former legal aid lawyer in Massachusetts and New York, where he represented low-income clients in affirmative and defense litigation related to debt collection, student loans, and foreclosure. So as I promised, these folks are super knowledgeable. So pleased to have Amy and Kat and Winston here today. And Amy, I'm gonna mute myself and take myself off camera and turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to be here. My name is Amy Zulata, and I'm the Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator at the Student Borrower Protection Center, as Maya mentioned. We're going to talk through the changes to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program under the waiver, and just a little bit of background on the Student Borrower Protection Center. We're a national nonprofit policy organization focused solely on alleviating the burden of student debt in the U.S. We engage in a mix of advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy to rein in industry abuses, protect borrowers' rights, and advance economic opportunity for the next generation of students. We're so excited to be here with you today. Thank you for having us. To start, we'll talk a little bit about the program and how it functioned until very recently, and then we'll get into the changes under the waiver. And then, as Maya mentioned, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we have people fielding questions and gathering common themes so that we can answer as many questions as possible at the end. But thank you so much, and here we are. Let me begin. So to start, we'll talk about the program as it was created. So Congress created the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program in 2007 to help public service workers who were struggling with student loan debt, and then also to help make sure that future students and graduates wouldn't be deterred from entering public service because of their student loan balances. To put it simply, public service loan forgiveness is the promise that if a borrower works in public service and makes payments for 10 years, the remainder of their debts will be forgiven. But as we'll see, and as I'm sure you know if you're already here, it's a bit more complicated than that. So first I'm going to explain how it worked, and then what some of the issues were, and how you can benefit from the current waiver period to access your own PSLF loan forgiveness. So how does PSLF actually work? So more than simply working in public service for 10 years, there are normally 4 specific criteria. First, you need to have a direct loan. That's one of several federal loan types. Second, you need to be in the correct repayment plan, which for the program is generally an income-driven repayment plan. Third, you need to work in public service. And finally, you need to make 120 qualifying payments, which is 10 years worth of payments. I'll drill down on some of these for a moment. So only direct loans qualify for public service loan forgiveness. Direct loans have been the main federal loan type since 2010. So if you took out a federal loan since then, it likely qualifies. But if you have an older loan, a federal family education loan, sometimes called FFEL loans, or a Perkins loan, those do not qualify. What you can do though is you can consolidate those loans into a new direct loan, which is like refinancing with the federal government, and it pays off the old federal loan and replaces it with a new federal loan. Under the normal program, when you did this, you lost any credit towards forgiveness that you had earned on the old loans that you were consolidating, since you're essentially taking out a new loan. But as we'll discuss during the waiver period, that's not the case. So it's important to know that under the normal program, most people were blocked out of it completely based on their loan type, and it had nothing to do with whether or not they actually did 10 years of service. Second, your direct loan needs to be in the right repayment plan, which is generally an IDR or an income-driven repayment plan. It doesn't matter how much you're paying, just that it's the right plan. And these plans go by names like income-based repayment, or IBR, income contingent repayment, or ICR, pay and repay. Some other payment plans can qualify under certain circumstances, but in general, you want to be on an income-driven repayment plan. Third, to get public service loan forgiveness, you need to work in public service. And the focus is on your employer, not on your role at the organization. You can work at a government organization, so that would cover most city, state, federal employees, a 501c3 nonprofit, or certain other nonprofits. You also have to work full-time, which is defined as 30 hours a week, or what your employer deems as full-time if it's over 30 hours a week. And the 30 hours can be with more than one employer if you have multiple part-time jobs that would add up to 30 hours a week. So finally, you need to make 120 of these qualifying payments, which are payments on the right loan, in the right payment plan, and during their correct employment. The payments have to be made in full and on time. And if you leave public service and then come back, you can continue accruing credits and you don't need to start over. So the payments don't need to be consecutive. So there are some impacts of COVID on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. First, really importantly, for those loans getting the payment pause, those that are owned by the federal government, each month of suspended payments counts towards PSLF loan forgiveness, toward the 120 total payments. However, you still need to meet the other criteria, and most importantly, you need to be employed by a public service employer. So now we'll talk a little bit about what changed in the program and why. So as you may know, the initial rejection rate was 99%. Only some 800 applications out of 90,000 were approved. And folks were being denied because they had the wrong loan, or they weren't in the right repayment plan, or some other technical reason that had nothing to do with whether or not a person actually did 10 years of public service work. And as you can imagine, this was a huge problem and an incredible failure for the public service employees that PSLF was meant to support. And many folks took out debt to get the education they needed to become teachers or government lawyers, specifically because they had been told that after 10 years of affordable payments, the remainder would be forgiven. But some good news, last year in the summer of 2021, the Department of Education, for the first time ever, issued something called a request for information, and they asked borrowers to tell them about their PSLF experience. And this was an opportunity for borrowers who had worked in public service, but who were going to get locked out of the program because of the bureaucratic program criteria, or someone who had delayed retirement to get those extra qualifying payments, to ask the Biden administration to fix the program once and for all. And nearly 50,000 borrowers submitted comments sharing their experience with PSLF, and they all had a consistent message that the program wasn't working for those it was meant to support. So within weeks of the request for information period ending, the federal government announced a special waiver period that would address many of the issues raised during the RFI period. And so for a limited time, the Department of Education will retroactively grant credits towards PSLF loan forgiveness to borrowers for months that previously didn't count for the program, either because they had the wrong loan type or because they weren't making the right payment. So we'll walk through each of these changes now. Essentially, what the department's waiver does is give public service workers credit towards loan forgiveness, regardless of what type of federal loan they have, for any period of employment since October 1st, 2007, when the program began, and as long as they were in qualifying public service employment and their loan wasn't in default, deferment, or forbearance. Even for months in which borrowers didn't actively make a payment, as long as the loan was in repayment status, they can receive credit. And these credits will be retroactive, so borrowers can receive credit for past payments that were previously ineligible. In short, for any months since October 1st, 2007, that a borrower had any type of federal loan, worked for a qualifying public service employer, and wasn't in default, deferment, or forbearance, that borrower can receive credit towards the 120 months required for loan forgiveness under PSLF. However, this waiver isn't completely automatic. So normally PSLF requires that borrowers have a specific loan type, direct loans, like I mentioned. And although the waiver allows borrowers with any loan type to get credit, those without direct loans must take some steps to convert their loans into direct loans through a process called consolidation, though they still will get credit for the time before the conversion. And almost all borrowers, regardless of loan types, will have to certify with the Department of Education any periods of qualifying public service work since that date of October 1st, 2007. And the idea there is that if the government doesn't know when you had qualifying work, it can't award you the right credits. So that's why it's so important to certify your employment. Importantly, the department's waiver only lasts until October 31st, 2022. So that means that any borrower who must change their loan type through consolidation or certify their public service work with the department must do so before this deadline of Halloween this year. This doesn't mean that everyone will receive their new credit towards loan forgiveness by that deadline, just that the paperwork has to be submitted. Credits will be given on a rolling basis. So the department could take more time beyond this October 31st deadline of this year to process all the people applying. Although if you get credits from the waiver, those are permanent. So if you don't receive enough credits to meet the 120 credit requirement, you can continue to accrue more credits after that deadline of October 31st, 2022, adding to those that you received during the waiver. So with that in mind, there are 3 things that all public service workers with federal loans should do. So just briefly, I'm going to go through each of these, but briefly, every borrower should confirm that your past and present employers are qualifying public service employers, determine what your loan types are and consolidate your loans if necessary, and then certify your employment with the Department of Education. So let's go over the first step. So first, you should confirm that you have a qualifying employer. Nothing about this requirement changed during the waiver. You still need to work in public service, except that during the waiver period, you don't still need to be employed at the time that you apply for forgiveness after your 120 payments. Remember that qualifying employers include any government employer, so federal, state, local, or tribal government, any nonprofits that have a 501c3 tax exempt status, and certain other nonprofits also qualify. However, unions and political organizations do not, and neither do any for-profit employers. If you aren't sure whether or not your employer qualifies as a public service employer, the Department of Education maintains a list of qualifying employers that you can search. It's important to note though that this list isn't necessarily exhaustive. So if your employer doesn't appear, but you still believe that you're in a qualifying public service employment, you can still proceed with the PSLF process. You can access this list by using the PSLF help tool, which is available at studentaid.gov. And the employer database is the first step in the help tool. So you can quickly access it by to check your past and present employer status. Okay, step 2. So what type of federal loan loans do you have? The 3 major loan types most folks today have are direct loans, federal family education loans or FFEL loans, and Perkins loans. For public service workers to get loan forgiveness for their FFEL and Perkins loans under the PSLF waiver, they'll have to consolidate, which is like a refinancing process. They have to consolidate those loans into a direct loan. Remember what's special about the waiver is that normally when you consolidated your loans, you lost any past credit towards forgiveness. But during the waiver that you can keep that past credit and apply it to the new consolidated loan. The final step that all public service workers with federal student loans should do is certify their qualifying employment with the Department of Education. Remember that qualifying employers are any level of government, 501c3 nonprofit employers, and certain other nonprofit employers. The form to do this is called the PSLF form, but it was previously called an employment certification form or an ECF. So if you submitted one previously, it would have been called an ECF, but now it's been rebranded to the PSLF form. So borrowers should certify their employment using the PSLF help tool, which is the same tool that we used in step 1 to confirm that your employers were public service employers. And the tool will generate the form for you, which your employer will have to sign. Okay, so, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so we've just discussed the 3 steps the borrower should take to make sure that they benefit from the current waiver. So now I'm going to briefly show you some step-by-step instructions on how to do all this. So we're going to start with confirming your employer is PSLF eligible. So you'll need to log into studentaid.gov again, and you're going to hover over Manage Loans located in the top toolbar, and then click on Public Service Loan Forgiveness in the drop-down menu. And you'll see the PSLF help tool there, which you should click to launch. Okay, borrowers can look up all of their employers since October 2007 in the help tool by entering their tax employer identification number or EIN and their dates of employment. And you can check your employer's EIN by looking at your W-2 or by asking your employer, or for some larger employers, you can also Google them. If your employer appears when you run the search, your employer is a confirmed public service employer, so you should proceed to the next steps of checking your loan types or consolidating if necessary. And if your employer doesn't appear, you could still be eligible because this list isn't exhaustive. It could just mean that no one from your organization has ever applied for PSLF in the past. So don't be discouraged if you don't see your employer there, especially if you work for a government agency or a 501c3 nonprofit and you know that you're eligible. So some eligible employers will show up as ineligible in this database. So once you've identified, or once you've determined whether your employers are eligible, you should confirm what loan types you have. This can be really confusing and many folks don't necessarily know. So to see all of your federal student loans, you should log in again to studentaid.gov And if you don't know your login information, I want to mention that you can reset the password and get access to it. You'll have a dashboard there that lists your loans, and any that say direct are direct loans, and any that don't say direct will need to be consolidated. And for a more granular list, you can also download your loan data, and you can see on this slide how to do that. So once you download your aid data, you'll be able to tell what type of loans you have. Here you can see 2 screenshots of the data report, and at the top each says loan type and each says FFEL for Federal Family Education Loan. They don't say direct, so they'll have to be consolidated. Now on this report, you'll also see that some loans that have been paid off already or already consolidated. You only need to confirm the ones with a balance because those are the ones you're trying to consolidate and get forgiven. Okay, so to consolidate your loans, okay, now if you have non-direct loans, you'll want to consolidate them. So to consolidate your loans, you're going to need to log into studentaid.gov, hover over Manage Loans in the top toolbar, and click on Consolidate My Loans. You can access the consolidation loan application here. It will then guide you through the steps you'll need to take, which include selecting which loans you want to include in the consolidation, confirming the amount and rate of the new loan, and selecting your payment plan and servicer, and then signing for the loan. Now here is a tip specific to the waiver. So if you have a mix of older and newer loans, so some will be closer to the 10 years needed for forgiveness under PSLF, if you consolidate all of the loans together, the new loan will be awarded as much credit as your oldest existing loan. So if you consolidate old and new loans, when the consolidated loan is ultimately forgiven, the entire amount will be forgiven. This is useful for folks who have older FFEL loans but newer direct loans. You might not think to consolidate your direct loans because they're already direct loans and they already qualify, but if you do consolidate them, they could be forgiven on the same timeline set by the older FFEL loans. Remember that for the regular PSLF program, you need to be enrolled in an IDR plan. So when you're consolidating, it's a good idea to select one of the IDR plans as your payment plan. Some of the names for these plans include Income-Based Repayment, or IBR, Income Contingent Repayment, or ICR, Pay and Repay. Okay, so finally, let's review how to certify your employment. Just like with confirming how your employers qualify, you'll need to log into studentaid.gov again. Hover over Manage Loans, located in the top toolbar, and then click on Public Service Loan Forgiveness. We're going to go back to the PSLF help tool. You'll remember this step from earlier. It was the first step in the help tool to add your employers. So you'll add your employers here, including the dates of employment that you worked for them. Then the PSLF help tool will guide borrowers through the next steps, including identifying which loans they want to include for PSLF loan forgiveness. Once you complete each of the tool steps, it will generate a form that you can use to certify your employment. Again, this form is called the PSLF form, formerly the Employment Certification Form, and it's the form you must submit to receive credit for under the PSLF waiver. Once you have the PSLF form, you'll need to have any employer you're claiming as a public service employer sign the form. And once the form is signed, you must submit it to the designated federal student loan servicer for processing to make sure that you get the maximum benefit that you're eligible for. Everyone must submit a new form that reflects all of their qualifying public service work by that October 31st, 2022 deadline to benefit from the waiver. So what's the process for getting forgiveness? This is the general process, but it applies to the waiver too. FIA, operating as Fed Loan Servicing, is currently the exclusive servicer for public service loan forgiveness. So borrowers seeking PSLF need to send the PSLF form to FIA, which will do a preliminary review of loan eligibility. And if you have a qualifying loan, your loan will then be transferred to FIA for servicing, at which point it will run through the other criteria such as employment and qualifying payments. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of problems with people finding out too late in the game that they thought they qualified, but that something had gone wrong. So for this reason, we advise you to submit a form as soon as you are interested in public service loan forgiveness, and then do it again each year until you reach those 10 years of payments. And then also that you do it every time you switch public service employers. You don't have to do this. You could document everything after 10 years, but this way you have a great chance of catching any issues early and then dealing with them as they arise. The Department of Education has stated that they are continuing to review PSLF cases on a rolling basis. So there's no exact timeline for when you'll receive notification from them. You may also have read that FedLoan is ending its contract with the department. This is true, and it was recently announced that another company is taking over. At this point, it's still okay to have things go to FedLoan because the transfer won't happen for a while. And if anyone has to have their account transferred, the companies will handle it. However, you should keep your own copy of all your records because sometimes things can get lost from one company to another. Okay, so now we'll just go over some important takeaways. So remember that credit will be given for months during which any loan type was in repayment status and it wasn't in default, deferment, or forbearance. The deadline to act is October 31st, 2022 to consolidate and or submit your PSLF form. And then, just go through the steps that I mentioned, like confirming your employer, confirming your loan types, consolidating if necessary, and then submitting a PSLF form for every public service employer you've had since 2007. And then if you experience any issues, you can always file a complaint. And I think that we now have time for questions.
All right, thank you, Amy. We have a number of questions, so sit tight, everyone. I will go to them in the order they came in, and Kat and Winston were diligently answering them in the chat as well, but I'm still going to read the questions and answers so that you all don't need to look at the chat because I think most of the questions I saw in here were questions that I had at one point or another. So I think probably if you had the question, others do as well. So here is the first one. If I am making $0 payments right now during the waiver period, do those still count as qualifying payments? And I believe the answer to that is yes.
Yes, thanks, Maya. And hi, folks. This is Winston. I work with Amy at the Student Borrower Protection Center. So the answer is yes, with the caveat that Amy included, which is that it counts as the payment for a qualifying payment, but you still need to satisfy the other requirement, the biggest one of which is having a qualifying employer. But it does count for the, are you in an IDR plan? Did you make a payment?
Okay, thank you, Winston. The next question was, does any employment history prior to 2007 count?
So the answer to that is no, and that's simply because PSLF was created in 2007 and Congress didn't create it to include retroactive work. So it's fully prospective. So your loans can be from before 2007, but that element of the employment has to be 2007 forward.
Okay,
so that's
thank
when you
you.
should start your clock in 2007, October of 2007.
But any loans you had prior to that can count, because that was a question that came up later. And I know for folks, myself included, who are old and graduated well before 2007, we're happy to know that even though we have loans that are old, our public interest work since 2007 counts.
Yes, though that is particularly relevant for this waiver period, right? Because chances are, if your loans are from before 2007, they're not going to be a direct loan. So you're going to need to, if you haven't already, consolidate them to get credit for the older loan. But after 2007, you're probably going to have to consolidate through the waiver to get credit towards PSLF.
That is very true. And I did, in fact, have to do that. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay, next question. So let's see. This is sort of a specific question about when payments were counted. So for example, if you made a loan payment on February 20th, but started your qualifying employment on February 21st, that February payment didn't count. This is in the old system. For this waiver, are they now looking at whether you were employed during the relevant month, or is it still tied to the technical date that the payment was made?
So for the waiver, they are not looking at actual payments made. They are looking only at the status of your account. So as long as your account was in a repayment status for that month, and you were employed during any period of that month, that should, employed that meet the right definitions, right? That should count. So although during the regular, completeness and on timeness of the payment were important through the waiver, it just matters whether your loan was in repayment for that month, which means not in default, not in deferment, and not in forbearance.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is from someone who says, if I consolidated prior to the waiver period, do I still lose the payments that were made before the loans were consolidated?
So you are, one of the types of borrowers that the waiver is specifically meant to help, right? So short answer is you do not still lose those. You affirmatively get credit for the prior work you did pre-consolidation. So from 2007 until the date you consolidated, for any month that you had a loan in repayment and also had qualifying employment, you'll get credit for that, even though normally you would not get credit for that. That's exactly what the waiver does.
Great, thank you, Winston. Okay, here is the next question. How are payments counted for borrowers who consolidated before the waiver? And please explain for federal, FEL, and Perkins consolidation versus private consolidation.
So I'll maybe go in reverse just to make sure folks are in the right headspace. So there is, for the purpose of PSLF, there really is no sort of private consolidation. So private consolidation is really just refinancing, right? And I think it's important to separate out these vocabularies. So if that's what this person meant by private consolidation, if you refinanced your federal loans on the private market to take advantage of a lower interest rate, unfortunately, your new loan is simply a private loan. It has no federal hook anymore, and it is not eligible for PSLF. And there's no way to undo that refinancing that you did on the private market. And that's very frustrating. And lots of folks made what felt like the right decision in the moment to get the lower interest rate and refinance, but are now ineligible for PSLF. For the first half of the questions about, how is it counted? It really is looking back to, as I said, like since 2007, as soon as your loan was in repayment status, any month that it was in repayment status and you also had qualifying employment will become a qualifying month. So with the way it works with the consolidation, that's true for FEL, for Perkins, for direct loans, for any of them. So with the consolidation factor, when you are consolidating a FEL or a Perkins loan, you're essentially bundling them together and taking out a new loan to pay off the old loans. What they're going to do is they're going to look at of the loans that you paid off that you're replacing of your original loans, how much credit they're going to give you the maximum credit possible, right? So they're going to look and say which of these underlying loans is the oldest, which of them has the most PSLF potential, and they're going to give your new consolidation loan credit that is equivalent to that. So Amy sort of alluded to this, but she talked about it explicitly, if you have sort of newer and older loans all together and you consolidate them together, your new consolidation loan will have as much PSLF credit as the oldest, most eligible of the underlying loans that go into it. And that's equal for FEL and Perkins loans. There's no distinguishing there.
Okay. Next question is someone who says, I was wondering if a state judicial clerkship is qualifying employment. I'm in a nonprofit now, but did a judicial clerkship last year, and I'm having a hard time finding the answer online.
Yep, so it's a state judicial clerkship is a form of government employment, and so that counts. The only type of government employment that does not count is literal members of Congress. So not staff and aides and council, but the elected official in Congress. And that's because they passed this law and so didn't want to sort of be benefiting themselves in their capacity as a member of Congress. But any other type of government employment, local all the way up to federal, is qualifying. So as long as that clerkship was actually an employee of the judiciary for that year, then that counts.
Great. And Winston, I'm seeing a comment that you made that I'm just hoping you can sort of repeat, that even though $0 payments during the pause count toward PSLF, but you still have to have the qualifying employer.
Yeah, and again, that's because the $0 payment satisfies the sort of, are you in the right payment plan? Did you make a payment on time and in full aspect of it? It's just that one part of what makes qualifying month towards the 120 months. So you still have to have the right qualifying employer. And were it not for the waiver, you would still need to also have a direct loan, right? So without the waiver, folks getting the benefit of the payment pause would still also need to have a direct loan. Because of the waiver that Amy discussed, that's no longer relevant. So the relevant question is, while you're getting that $0 benefit, were you employed, and were you employed with a government or nonprofit employer? And if so, then yes, it counts towards PSLF.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is, if you have 120 qualifying payments already in your FFEL loan, and then you consolidate to a direct loan, does the repayment still need to be IDR or no, because you have already made all of the qualifying payments?
So it's a great question, because I think a lot of people are in this position, right? They've never consolidated, they've been working in the right field for a decade or more, and are now going to suddenly apply for the first time and suddenly hopefully get their loans forgiven. So if you have 120 qualifying payments already, then you don't need to be in an IDR plan when your loan is consolidated, because it'll get forgiven. The timelines, however, for consolidation and for forgiveness are not perfectly aligned. So what I mean by that is, to access PSLF loan forgiveness, many people will have to consolidate. Their consolidation will probably get very likely, but not definitely, will get processed before their loan forgiveness. So you might sit with your new loan, your new consolidation loan, for 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 months before your PSLF loan forgiveness is processed. So there is a world in which you will have to make payments on your new loan. Now, currently, right, direct loans payment pause, no one's making payments. If you consolidated last month, chances are you'll have it all done before May, when payments are set to resume currently. But for some people, they will consolidate with 120 credits and have to make a payment or 2. In that instance, you don't need the IDR to be your repayment plan, because you don't need to be accruing more credit towards PSLF. I think the most general advice, without knowing anyone's personal circumstances, is to say, select IDR anyway, even if you don't think you need 120, because for most people, it is going to be affordable. And if something happened and you miscounted, or you forgot that you were in a forbearance or deferment at some point 7 years ago and you're 1 or 2 counts short, you're then already set up to benefit and keep accruing. You might think you're going to be accruing 123, but it turns out you were 3 behind and you're getting just in at 120. So I'd recommend, unless someone has a good reason not to, consolidate, get into an IDR plan. If you make overpayments on your new loan, the government will refund them. So if it turns out you didn't need any more and you make 2 or 3 payments while you're waiting for your loan to get processed and forgiven, they will credit you back for any overpayments made on a direct loan, and consolidation loans are direct loans.
Thank you for that, Winston. Yeah, I have a friend who got a very healthy check in just such a scenario, basically being paid back for several months worth of payments.
So one note on that, Maya, and it is a little confusing. Yeah. You are only eligible for a refund on payments you made on a direct loan. So if you're someone who is sitting on a FFEL loan for 13 years of qualifying credit, you're like, great, I'm going to get forgiveness. You're not going to get 3 years worth of refunds. It's only people who have a direct loan, have been making payments on a direct loan, and are somehow, because of the waiver, getting extra credits they previously thought were ineligible and are getting over the finish line, who will get that refund. So someone who's going overnight from a FFEL to a direct
Yeah,
and getting
you
forgiveness,
don't get
not
that.
going to do it. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you for that. Okay. Here's the next question. If you've already certified prior employers as qualifying for PSLF, do you have to resubmit one final form that includes all employers, or is it sufficient to just include the most recent employer and your most recent dates on that final form?
So we're in a bunch of lawyers here, so I'll say it depends, right? It depends. It depends on when you submitted those forms. If you submitted forms for your prior employers, but they were, you had the wrong loan, so you were deemed ineligible, so those were never really counted, then they aren't in the system and you'll have to submit them again. If you've submitted prior employers and each time you submitted it, you got back an accurate count and you were accruing, each year, however often you certified, then you don't need to recertify time periods of employment that have already gotten credit for you, but you do need to submit paperwork for any time period that you haven't gotten credit yet. Even if the employer was never the problem, if it was the loan type was the problem, you're going to need to refile a form for any period that hasn't already gotten credit for yourself. But the most blanket advice, even though it's a lot of footwork for some people, is just recertify anything you're not sure about. Because the worst case scenario, right, would be to think that you're covered and then the deadline passes and then it turns out for some reason you're not and you've missed the opportunity to get that.
Okay, thank you. I think this has been covered because some of these came in, before I started asking questions. But let's see. It says for those loans consolidated from prior to 2007, would they still need to be reconsolidated under an IDR? And I think that is covered by your prior answer, which is should really just have everything consolidated in IDR to be better safe than sorry.
Yes, so if what you did in 2007 was if you've never had a loan eligibility issue, right? So if you consolidated once and it's always been into a direct loan, then there's no reason to reconsolidate. But I'd say, yes, it doesn't hurt to reconsolidate if you think you're going to get loan forgiveness, and it doesn't hurt to be an IDR, especially if you can get a refund on it. But if the only change in activity you've done is prior to 2007, then you should know, like, have you been accruing payments since 2007 and everything's been fine, in which case you're good to go. But if you are having to make another change to your account, then yes, I would redo every step because clearly you were somehow being blocked from the program before and want to make sure you're taking advantage of it during the waiver period.
Okay, thank you for that one, Sten. Next question. When did the COVID pause start and when is it ending?
So it started in March of 2013. It sort of started as an executive action, and then the CARES Act took effect and they did it retroactively. So I think it's like March 13th of 2013, I think. It's March of 2020. So it started right when COVID started, when the CARES Act was passed. March 13th, 2020, and it's been extended multiple times. Currently, it is through May 1, and there is a large coordinated effort to get it extended again because we're not out of the pandemic. People are still struggling financially, economically. There's still a public health crisis. So we don't know when it's going to ultimately end, but the current deadline and folks should be preparing for payments to resume in May. You might not actually have to make a payment in May. You might get a statement in May for a payment due in June, but the pause officially ends after May 1. Okay. For now.
Great. Okay, next is a two-part question. Here's the first part. Is it worth applying if you are not sure if you are eligible, or could that harm me in some way? So that's the first part. I'll let you answer that, then I'll go into the second part.
Yeah, well, because of the waiver, the only real eligibility question, there's really two, I guess, is your employer qualified? And that's why we recommend folks as step one, go to the PSLF help tool and search their employer. Because if your employer is definitely not qualified, then there's no point in doing these other steps, right? That's always going to be the backbone of the program. Do you have a government or nonprofit employer? And certain nonprofits don't qualify, right? But you can search your employer. That's the first step. The other reason why you might not be eligible is if you've had massive periods of deferment, forbearance, or default, which unfortunately a lot of people have because of servicer misconduct and steering. In that case, I would still recommend you do this process for two reasons. One, you want to make sure your loan is going forward eligible for PSLF. If you're in the wrong loan type, you still want to consolidate, and now is the best time to consolidate because you'll get the benefit of past work being credited towards your loan. But the other reason is there's also a big push from our organization and many partners to have the government give credit for those periods of non-payment, right? So we said it's only for periods of repayment, which doesn't include deferment, forbearance, default. Because of the history of servicer misconduct and because of how poorly borrowers are counseled, there's a huge call for the government to give credit for those 3 time periods: default, deferment, forbearance. So even if you're someone who under the current waiver isn't going to benefit as much as you could because of your periods of non-payment, it's probably a good idea to consolidate and get yourself as part of the waiver so that if that policy changes, you're positioned to take advantage of it. So really, the only reason not to do it is if you just don't have the right kind of employer. That hasn't changed at all. There are, as Amy mentioned, some reasons why consolidation can be risky. If you're trying to get income-driven repayment forgiveness, being in the IDR plan for 20 or 25 years, that currently does not have a waiver, so your clock will restart. You won't get credit on a new consolidation loan for time spent in IDR on your old loans. We're moving for a waiver to have that, to waive that as well. They should be in parallel, IDR and PSLF consolidation policy. The other potential risk of a consolidation is that you might lose any interest rate credits or benefits you have on your old FFEL loan. You might have like an 1/8 of a percentage point deduction as a benefit on that loan. And if you consolidate, you'll lose that. But again, most people are consolidating with the goal of having your loans completely forgiven. So that's usually a worthwhile trade-off for most borrowers.
Okay. And the second part of the question, and I think lots of us can sympathize and feel the same, I feel overwhelmed about all of this and these changes. Are there reputable groups available to help me through this, of course, for compensation? And I think that's a good question because, I feel like I've gotten lots of solicitations, like unasked for solicitations myself. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And most of the groups just, feel pretty shady, and I just put them straight into the recycle bin. But are there reputable groups out there who will sort of sit down with someone, look at their everything going on, and help them figure it out?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is, and I dropped it in the chat earlier, but we can circulate it again, is check out our website, protectborrowers.org/PSLF. So protectborrowers.org/PSLF. And that has little video snippets of basically the presentation that Amy gave. So you can watch the 2-minute video on how to consolidate. You can watch the 2-minute video on what is the waiver. That way you don't have to sit through the whole thing again. It has the same step-by-step screen grabs to walk you through the steps. So that's a resource that's out there. In terms of getting additional assistance, it can be tough, and it varies across the country whether there are, frankly, just student loan law is hard. It's confusing, despite the fact that, many of us as lawyers went to school, have student loans, smart enough people. It's just very confusing. It's very esoteric. So there's not necessarily good resources in every community, unfortunately. But it's worth asking around, and maybe you can become the resource in your community. In terms of paying for assistance, I'll first make the big caveat that none of these things require payment, right? There's a huge difference between paying for the service of having someone else do something for you, right? We pay tax preparers sometimes because we don't want to do our taxes. Like, that is a different type of paying someone versus someone who says, pay me and I'll get you access to like the special Biden loan forgiveness, right? Like the scammy side of it. And then there are some companies that operate in the middle, right? They don't really explain that you could probably do this yourself if you carve out a couple hours on a Saturday afternoon, and they try to leverage their seemingly relative expertise to extract money from often low-income borrowers. So I'm a little hesitant to tell people, yes, you can go out there and pay someone to help you, and there's resources to do that because of this. You even mentioned it, because there is this pop-up industry of predatory actors who take money to do a relatively simple service. So the first thing I'd say is do a little bit of self-help, look at our videos, talk to your servicer. Servicers should be the free service to help you do this. And if you know what you're asking for, and if you can come away from this presentation or online resources with a couple of nuggets of knowledge that you know are your rights, like there's a waiver going on right now, and you can get credit for past work on PSLF. You know the word consolidation now, you know a couple of things. Your servicer should be able to help you navigate that. There is not a specific service that comes to mind to me that I would recommend for people to go and pay for service the way you might pay tax preparer. You can look in your community for consumer credit counselors. Look, if you're qualifying to be a legal aid recipient, you can check with legal services in your community to see if they have references. You can check with your state's regulator or your state's attorney general. They probably have a borrower resource page, both of those offices. So I would recommend that. But again, caution folks when they are going to engage for compensation with any company, just make sure they're legit. Make sure this isn't something that if you have the time you could do for yourself. I'm not going to, if someone wants to pay someone to do work for them, that's a totally separate conversation. But just be really, really careful about who you pay to do this work. And then also carve out that 2 or 3 hours on the Saturday afternoon if you're able to, and try to do some of it yourself, because that's frankly, the most safe and surefire way to get this done.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see, I'm trying to be mindful of time here. We have a few more questions. I submitted my employment certification for my 9th year of employment in August. And despite calls and emails, I cannot get an updated count from FedLoan, and they will not provide me with a timeline. Is there someone besides FedLoan I can speak to? And this makes me think of Amy's presentation, how there might be a new servicer, which this seems like the absolute world's worst time for them to be changing this when, thousands of us are going through this process. But how do you get through?
Yeah, so first of all, because of the transfer, I'll just say make sure you keep records of all the sort of communications or paperwork that you filed. Keep your own record just in case anything's lost in the transition. If someone submitted, what's really hard right now is that there's really no reliable timeline that anyone can estimate or sort of share out. So someone submitting the form in August, you'd like to think that would have been processed by now. That seems more than a reasonable amount of time. But really, there's no way to say with certainty. What I would do is, if you can't get through to FedLoan, then there's 2 problems happening, right? One is that you haven't gotten the answer, like you just substantively want to know. And the second is that your servicer is not communicating well with you, right? So I would do 2 things. I would file a complaint about the servicer and their availability and the fact that they're not getting back to you. And then I would also, and you can do that with the CFPB and your state regulator as well. I would recommend you do that with both. And then I would separately file a complaint with the Federal Student Aid Ombudsman. That's the Department of Education Ombudsman to help students navigate this system and to be an interface with the servicers that are contracted by them. So I would file that complaint. If you Google FSA Ombudsman complaint, like that'll be one of the first hits. I have to admit, I have found on their website, it sometimes takes a little poking around, but there is that feature there where you can file a written complaint or even call. And to get the substantive answer, I would go that route. So with the ombudsman, I would go say you just it's been 6 months, I'm trying to get an answer. Also include the fact that no one's getting back to you, and hopefully that gets you an answer quickly. And then for the fact that no one answered you, file a complaint with the CFPB and your state AG.
Great. This is a somewhat follow-up to that. Another person who's been waiting a long time. It's someone who became eligible for forgiveness over a year ago and who has submitted all of the relevant forms up to this point. Should they resubmit a final PSLF form? And again, someone waiting for over 6 months to hear back.
Yeah, I mean, if they are not someone who thinks they need the waiver, like if they just think they already had a loan and it's accrued, then they shouldn't have to file anything more. If the government, which is to say, if the government already has pre-waiver all the information they would possibly need from them to say that their loans are canceled, they shouldn't have to do anything more. So it's sort of the same deal. If they're trying and haven't gotten an answer, well, if you haven't yet reached out, reach out, see what you can get from them. If you haven't gotten an answer, then I would, again, file a complaint with the FSA Ombudsman, file a complaint with the CFPB in your state. But you shouldn't have to file more paperwork. You shouldn't have to redo the certification if you were already ready to go, you think, for forgiveness before. And it doesn't hurt, right? Like when in doubt, just file, because we want to make sure everyone gets past the finish line, paperwork wise, by October. So it shouldn't hurt to do that, but you also have a few more months before October. So you might get an answer before having to resubmit everything.
Okay. Okay, let's see. I know we're running out of time and there's actually still quite a few. So pardon my pausing. Some of them I think have been covered. Let's see. One question, pay as you earn repayment plan. Does this count as income-driven repayment?
Yes, that's one of the IDR plans. So yes.
Okay, excellent. How long are the consolidations taking right now?
Consolidations should just take maximum sort of 7 weeks. That's a sort of separate process that shouldn't have been slowed down too much. So within 1 or 2 months, you should have your new loan.
Okay. And what about once you submit the paperwork? Is there for PSLF? How long is that taking?
That's the big unknown. That is just a total black box, because some of the responses the people have been getting their loans forgiven, getting credit, are based on an audit of paperwork that the department already had on file from years past, and some are responses to people filing new paperwork. So we really don't have a reliable estimate at this point.
And I sent mine in back in November, and I sent it certified return receipt. Is that something you're recommending? Or I didn't know if I was just being neurotic, but I did it, and it took like 2 months to get the slip back.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to do that. The forms on it tell you the different delivery methods, fax, mail, et cetera. And as long as you do one of those reliably and then keep the documentation, you might want to make a little note to yourself, like, again, attorney is sort of like a contemporaneous record, right, that I sent it at this point. That should be fine. If there's an issue, it's not going to be a matter of if you have the return slip, it's going to be something bigger, but just keeping any form of record should be sufficient.
Okay. Let's see. And if folks can stay a little bit longer, I have just, I'd like to keep plugging through some of these questions. Okay. We have, I consolidated my old 2004 loans into direct loans in 2015. I've been in correct employment the entire time. I applied for PSLF in November 2021, and they only credited me for payments since my 2015 consolidation. So it sounds like this person didn't get their prior months counted.
So there's been an issue of Fed loans sending people letters that say, here's your count, it reflects the waiver, and then the count just doesn't reflect the waiver, like full stop. That seems to be what's happening. Which is a huge problem. We've been tracking it. We've been flagging it for the Department of Education. That's another example where you can probably sit tight and there'll be a refreshed letter once the department actually counts your waiver and send it to you. But making a record is super important. You can take that letter you got and submit it to the ombudsperson and say, this doesn't seem right. Can you please confirm, what my actual count is? Or you can, they are starting in April. They're going to open up basically an appeals process for PSLF called reconsideration. They haven't released any information other than that it'll open in April and it'll be for reconsideration. So in another couple of weeks, folks will have another option if they think they're not getting the right count. But this is not an outlier. We've seen this happening, and it seems to just be a premature letter going out, and there should be a follow-up letter, but definitely keep records.
Okay. Is there a resource for people who had a shady consolidation? For example, making a direct loan into a FEAL loan. What recourse do borrowers have? Imagining a circumstance where a person couldn't access a refund of overpayment because their loans were improperly consolidated into a non-direct loan.
Yeah. So this sounds like, so again, it's really important to distinguish between consolidation, which is the government process, and refinancing. And there's no way to consolidate with the government into a FEL, right? So this is only, so it sounds like this person is talking about a private refinancing from a private lender paying off your government loans. And in that instance, there's really no way to undo that process. That loan is just no longer eligible for PSLF or any federal benefits. In terms of recourse, if someone was like if there was like totally separate from PSLF, if there was fraud or misrepresentation, then there might be a cause of action there under state or federal law, but that's separate from just the mechanics of the administration of the federal student loan system. Once the loan exits the system by being privately refinanced, that's just sort of a done deal. But there might be, again, private claims against a lender if they were shady and if they did misrepresent the nature of the new loan.
Okay. Does government employment while in school count?
I think this is on one of Amy's slides. So employment has to be what's considered full-time, which is generally at least 30 hours a week or more if the employer considers full-time to be more than 30 hours a week. So it doesn't matter if you're also in school, it just matters, are you working full-time? So if you have like an internship with the government or a part-time job with them or any job with them that is less than 30 hours a week, it will not count. But if you're a full-time government employee and also going to school nights and weekends, then that sounds like it would work. But you have to keep in mind, so a lot of people, when they go back to school, put their loans in deferment, and currently deferment does not count for the waiver. Again, that might change, but currently, if you're just tabulating what you can expect in terms of a payment count, you still need to have a loan that's in repayment. And if you're in school and put your loans in deferment, that won't be considered in repayment.
Okay. Somewhat similar. If my loans have always been in forbearance because I graduated in May of 2020, then it went straight into the COVID pause. Do I still get credit? Do I get any credit for my 1 year of qualifying work?
So the payment pause does count. The grace period after while you're in school and then at 6 months after you're in school generally does not count. So it depends on when your loan switched over to the payment pause forbearance, which uniquely, it's like the only forbearance except for military service that will count. So it sounds like this person, as long as they had the right job, will at some point start getting credit during the pause, but it's likely going to be 6 months after they graduate because there is a grace period that's built into student loans. But they should just confirm, but they should expect at some point, probably at the end of 2020, to start accruing credit under the pause.
Okay. I think you may have touched on this. This is the last question. Is it worth submitting employer certification if I worked less than 30 hours a week for the particular employer? Now that I have consolidated to federal loan servicing, shall I go back to them and sign up for an income-driven payment plan? I didn't specify which plan I wanted previously.
Yeah. So these are sort of two separate questions, it sounds like. And on the consolidation IVR plan, especially if you're not done with PSLF, like, yes, you should go back and sign up. It doesn't matter if you didn't do it earlier. Again, that consolidation loan is currently under the payment pause. Everything is counting. So you can go and do IDR online. You can call them. So yes, you should get on the right plan so that when payments do resume, you're getting credit. In terms of the part-time employment, if you didn't, so you can have an employer with less than 30 hours, you can get credit if you also have a second job, and cumulatively they both qualify, and cumulatively they're both together 30 or more hours a week. If you just had a job in like 2013 for a couple months or for a year or two where you were working less than 30 hours a week, then it's not worth going back to get them to certify your employment, because that employment isn't going to get you any credit towards PSLF. If you had, again, multiple part-time employers, they'll aggregate the hours, so that might be worth it. But if you just had one employer with less than 30 hours, it probably isn't worth it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Gosh, what a wealth of information. Lots of expressions of thanks here in the comments, and I want to echo that. This has been so helpful. Folks are asking if the slide deck will be available. We have recorded the session. So Amy, Kat, and Winston, can we share your slides?
Yes, and we can send you a PDF version too, so that folks don't have to watch the video. They can just click through it. Okay,
wonderful. Well, I want to thank you all. And what I will do is I will post the recording and the slides on the CEJ website, so you can go back and look for them there, or email me and I'll send them your way. Again, thank you to all of you at the Student Borrower Protection Center. You all have been amazing. It's so nice to know there are folks out there looking out for borrowers, and want to thank everyone else for attending. We had over 82 people at the height of the presentation. So thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.